Hey there. We're going to spend some time today talking about the United Kingdom's foreign relations. I will tell you for the umpteenth time that this is not mostly a class about international relations or war and peace, but we'll take a look at the United Kingdom's relations with basically everything but the European Union. I'm actually going to give you a break from that particular topic today. So, as a framing device, I think we should start by noting that there's a lot of commentators on British politics and history, including the author of your textbook, who adopt the perspective that the United Kingdom is in the middle of a big identity crisis. And I'm not 100% convinced that it's always useful to characterize a country in the same way that you would characterize like a person trying to figure out what career they should pursue in their life, but it's going to lead us into some useful information, so we're going to go with that framing for now. Number one, identity crisis number one is, without its empire, is Britain still a superpower? Do we still matter without all these colonies? If you rewind by 150 years, even after the American Revolution, even after the independence of the United States, which is not nearly as big a deal for Britain as Americans tend to think it is, there is just no question that 150, 200 years ago, the United Kingdom is a global superpower. It has the largest empire in human history. It has a flourishing economy. It's the home of the Industrial Revolution. It has thriving trade networks. It's one of the world's major financial centers. It has a powerful army and a very powerful navy. There's no question whatsoever that the United Kingdom is a superpower, if not the superpower, if you go back to, I don't know, the 19th century or so. That said, fast forward, and as some clever person on the internet has cleverly and subtly pointed out, that empire is not going to last. By 1974, nearly all British colonies have gained independence. And so that's going to raise some questions about what role it is that the United Kingdom plays in the world, in addition to the questions that we've already talked about in this class about, say, how do we continue to run a profitable economy, and what should the state's role be now that it's no longer busy administering this vast empire. It's worth noting, of course, that the UK is not a non-entity in international affairs. It still has some significant sources of strength in both war and diplomacy. It's got a large military. It's one of the world's few nuclear powers. It has veto power at the United Nations Security Council. It has ties to many of its former colonies through the institution of the Commonwealth. So it is by no means, diplomatically or militarily meaningless, but its status has been significantly diminished. And there's some strains of British political commentary and ideology that are really trying to grapple with what to do in the aftermath of losing that identity as an imperial superpower. Question number two, identity crisis number two for the UK, if you want to go with this frame, is, are we a European power or are we an Atlantic power? There is a long, long history of a close relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom. They seem to have gotten over the War of 1812 pretty well by this point. And there's been really considerable cooperation between American and British governments in the last 100 plus years. But as Britain's power has diminished, there's plenty of people in the UK who argue that the UK is kind of doomed to be a junior partner to the United States, and that Britain should maybe instead pursue more influence through the European Union and through other international organizations. So if you want to think about the UK as having these identity crises, you can think about, are we a superpower or not, and are we a European power or are we an Atlantic power? Okay, that framing in mind, and you can kind of take that or leave that. You don't really need to worry about whether the UK is ever going to find itself. It's not actually the primary purpose of the CompGov course. Let's jump into a couple of recent events in British foreign policy history. Number one, as I said, the United Kingdom has not necessarily quieted down, has not completely ceased to project military power, so 4 interventions worth noting. Number one, in 1982, I said that the British had lost most of their colonies by 1974. They haven't lost all of them. And one that they actually continue to retain as an overseas dependency, I think is the formal status, is this tiny group of islands off the eastern coast of Argentina, known as the Falklands to the British or the Malvinas to the Argentines. In 1982, the Argentine government launches an invasion of the Falklands. And it's just worth noting, there's like 2,000 people on these islands. This is not a massively economically important territory for the United Kingdom. This may or may not be super strategically important in the Cold War context, but it's definitely not gigantic. But But in 1982, Argentina, which is really, for a long time maintained that it should have sovereignty over the Malvinas, launches an invasion of what the British call the Falklands. Margaret Thatcher decides she's going to deploy troops. She sends in the Marines, and they fight a 10-week undeclared war, resulting in hundreds of casualties, the result of which is that the British continue to control the Falklands. So depending how you see this could be Margaret Thatcher standing up for British sovereignty, protecting the rights of these otherwise defenseless British settlers far away from home, or it could be a massive waste of life in defense of this idea of a bygone empire. Depends on your perspective. Fast forward a couple of decades after the 9/11 attacks in the United States, Britain, along with many other countries in the world, will join the United States intervention in Afghanistan. Worth noting, the UK is a member of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and thus is actually bound by treaty to respond to an attack against any NATO member state, as if Britain itself had been attacked. So the UK is going to commit a significant number of troops, eventually under NATO command, to Afghanistan. That intervention will last for a while. Then, in 2003, more controversially, George W. Bush's administration in the United States is going to start going around to the United Nations and to their allies, trying to drum up support for an invasion of Iraq. And they give a couple of different justifications: bringing democracy, overthrowing Saddam Hussein, who's a longtime dictator, and his many abuses. Potentially, they make the claim that Iraq is a state sponsor of terrorism, or at least allowing terrorism to happen there. But the primary rationale that at least catches on with Tony Blair's government in the UK is that Iraq is illegally developing weapons of mass destruction, that they have retained, contrary to their treaty commitments, chemical and biological weapons stockpiles, and that they are pursuing the development of a nuclear weapons program, which would be fairly destabilizing in the region and in the world. It's worth pointing out, and we can say this with great confidence because it's almost 20 years after the fact, that the evidence didn't really pan out for any of those things. And there's been significant journalism and scholarship looking into the ways in which intelligence was distorted in the United States and in the United Kingdom in order to make a case for war in Iraq that actually wasn't as strong as those governments made it out to be. But at any rate, in 2003, Tony Blair decides that he is going to commit British forces to join the United States in that invasion of Iraq. And that is massively more controversial in the UK and in the world compared to that invasion of Afghanistan. The UK ends up being really the major, the biggest country the biggest military rather, to commit military force to Iraq after the United States. And that's going to lend the Bush administration some amount of legitimacy in saying, we're not just going it alone. This isn't just an American grudge. This is an international coalition. So Tony Blair's intervention in Iraq allows the United States to say that. Finally, in 2011, the United Kingdom and France are going to help lead, along with the United States, an international intervention against Muammar Gaddafi's government in Libya. And that's just one other example of the UK kind of flexing its military muscle in order to, in the UK's justification, try and promote stability in a fairly distant region. Second thing worth considering is what is always euphemistically referred to as the special relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States. So that term, special relationship, doesn't just refers to the cooperation between the UK and the US in trade and foreign policy. Couple of reasons why the US and the UK have for a long time had such a close relationship and such a kind of natural alliance. Some of those are historical, right? So those countries are on the same side in World War I, in World War II, in the Cold War. Some of those reasons are ideological. I think politicians on both sides of the Atlantic really like to say that the US and the UK have similar commitments to similar versions of liberal democracy, of free markets. And then, of course, there's lots of sort of cultural and interpersonal ties between the US and the UK, common language, some degree of shared history, et cetera, et cetera. That said, the special relationship has come under strain multiple times, particularly in the last couple of decades, for a few reasons. One recent challenge that relationship has faced is what I was just talking about, the Blair government's decision to commit troops to Iraq. The Iraq War was very controversial in the United Kingdom. A really, really narrow majority of the British public supported the invasion by the time that the invasion was actually launched. But there was significant debate and significant protest in the UK, as there was in the United States. And so a number of investigations, including a number of committees of parliament, and then Tony Blair's successor, Gordon Brown, all commissioned a variety of inquiries into the Iraq War, and specifically into the question of whether there was actually good enough intelligence indicating that Iraq had a weapons of mass destruction program that was, certain enough to support this invasion of Iraq. So Gordon Brown, when he comes into office after Tony Blair leaves in 2007, is going to commission this inquiry known as the Chilcot Inquiry. The final report of that inquiry doesn't come out until 2016, but it concludes that Tony Blair's government had overstated and distorted the intelligence supporting intervention in Iraq. So that's a significant blow, obviously, to Tony Blair's historical legacy and to the British public's trust in its intelligence establishment. But it's also a pretty big deal in terms of British trust in the relationship with the United States, because there's a perception among lots of people that the UK had kind of blindly followed the United States into a war that was perhaps unnecessary, perhaps counterproductive, perhaps a waste of blood and treasure. And so many people in the United Kingdom are going to be reluctant to do that again. Another recent challenge is that Donald Trump's administration was quite unpopular in the United Kingdom, and there is no better graphic illustration of that than this balloon of Trump as a baby, which was flown in London after a little bit of legal wrangling in 2018 during a visit by Donald Trump to the United Kingdom. So that there's been, again, many people, certainly not an overwhelming consensus, but lots of people in the United Kingdom during the Trump administration sort of started questioning more aggressively whether the United States was really going to be reliable as a primary partner for the United Kingdom, particularly in terms of pursuing common goals of, say, promoting democracy and human rights abroad. One other thing to consider in analyzing the future of the special relationship is, I told you I would leave it alone, but I can't entirely, Brexit. Lots of people advocating for Brexit. So one of the major arguments against Brexit is this is going to damage the British economy because Europe is by far our biggest trade partner, and Brexit is likely going to make it much more difficult for the UK to trade with Europe. And a lot of advocates for Brexit, a lot of Leave campaigners answer that argument by saying, well, we have this special relationship with the United States, and that's going to allow us to negotiate a bilateral, so two countries negotiating together, deal with the United States to lower tariffs, to promote investment, et cetera, et cetera. And that relationship with the United States will help us compensate for any negative economic effects of Brexit. This has not happened yet. The Biden administration is not, as of this recording in July 2021, making any really rapid moves to make this deal happen. But keep an eye out for that. It could be either a significant boost to the special relationship or a significant continuing challenge. Last thing to consider is the situation of foreign policy in the British Constitution, that delightful, ambiguous, unwritten document. So a couple of basics. The Prime Minister is effectively the Commander-in-Chief of the British Armed Forces. The Prime Minister is in charge of setting the foreign policy agenda. This is one of those areas where the Queen has a role, but it's purely symbolic. And so if you want to be super technical about it, then technically the power to order military action rests with the Crown. But in practice, owing to those long-standing constitutional conventions of parliamentary supremacy over and, the monarch kind of sitting back and letting the elected authorities make the decisions, owing to those conventions, in point of fact, it's the Prime Minister and the Cabinet who make those decisions about war and peace and foreign policy. There is no equivalent of the United States Constitution's requirement that the legislature declare war. There is no formal requirement that Parliament authorize the Prime Minister to make war or to deploy troops or to take any particular foreign policy action. And so in principle, the Prime Minister's powers, the executive powers, are really, really vast in the areas of war and peace. However, in the last couple of decades, there's been a couple of changes that are going to call into question whether the Prime Minister will forever continue exercising just total unilateral authority over war and peace. So in 2003, Tony Blair went to Parliament and asked them to vote a resolution approving his plan to invade Iraq. He didn't have to do that, but a couple of his cabinet ministers convinced him that he would get more public support. His decision would have more legitimacy if he didn't just take it on his own authority, but if Parliament also went on record approving that decision. And so that helped set a precedent for prime ministers going to the legislature to ask their approval or to ask their advice or to ask sort of their blessing for their foreign policy decisions. Gordon Brown, when he came into office in 2007, sort of proposed a package of ideas about constitutional reform, which had also been a major theme of the Blair government. And among those was that Brown said, well, I'm going to lay out a mechanism for consulting Parliament on matters of war and peace. He actually had an explicit stated intention to try and remove some of those unilateral one-man foreign policy making powers from the Prime Minister and to share them with Parliament. Really important to note, didn't actually get implemented, but it did suggest that there is some major conversation in British politics among the elites, among the people who have this power, about the executive sharing some of its war-making powers with the legislature. Finally, in 2013, kind of backing up that idea that prime ministers are no longer super comfortable unilaterally going to war, in 2013, Prime Minister David Cameron said, I would like to get involved in Syria. I would like to deploy force against the government of Bashar al-Assad in what was an increasingly bloody civil war. Against the government that had been increasingly obviously transgressing human rights in that country. But Cameron said, I want to do this. I think I have a very strong case for this intervention, but I'm going to go to Parliament and ask for their approval. Parliament voted Cameron down. A bunch of Conservative members of Parliament defected. Labour turned against the intervention. And Cameron actually backed down from that plan. He ultimately did not deploy force in Syria in the way that he had wanted because Parliament had said no. He came back, gave a speech, and said, I respect that decision. So the last thing I want you to note is that foreign policy technically, super technically made by the Queen, practically the Prime Minister has powers over those, over making foreign policy, making war and peace. But increasingly, prime ministers are looking to Parliament to lend some legitimacy, to lend some support, to lend some sort of veneer of democracy, of democratic decision-making to their foreign policy decisions. I will leave it there. Hopefully that gives you enough to think about. Thanks very much, and see you soon.